Ping.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, we got a notification. This means we are live at the moment.
We are live.
So, with the thousands of viewers that are watching and listening, welcome. John, why don't you just take it away?
I'll take it away. Welcome to episode 22 of the Reimaging Work podcast with Rogier Noort and myself, John Winger. And we have two very special guests. That's Kenneth Mikkelsen and Anders Abild. And Kenneth and Anders are co-founders of Future Shifts. And Future Shifts is a global network of leadership development practitioners. And they aim to help leaders rethink, redefine, and reshape their organizations so that they're better prepared for new futures. They have developed a leadership compass, and hopefully in this conversation we'll get to hear more about that. Anders brings to Future Shifts his focus and passion for the inner world of leaders, around that self-awareness stuff, understanding of self, identity, and values. And Kenneth brings his focus on the outer world of leaders, learning, connecting, collaborating with others, societal change, and megatrends. And so it's my pleasure to welcome you both, Kenneth and Anders.
Welcome, guys.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us, guys.
Well, very excited to hear what unfolds in the conversation.
Absolutely.
I've had many conversations already with you, Kenneth, and I know the work that both of you have done is really fascinating. Just to start with, to ask both of you, what would you say was, I mean, I've got to give an introduction. What would you say, from your words, is your sort of field of interest and expertise?
You can start.
Should I start out?
Sure. There you go, John. Oh, was it me?
Are you there?
You're there.
Yeah.
I haven't touched it.
Maybe. Yeah, no, but I mean, I think, you know, John, also I've mentioned this to you earlier on also, that when people ask me what I do, it's often a difficult question to answer in a very short time, because I mean, I'm a generalist. I mean, I live in more than one world, and what I mean by that is actually that I've had, I mean, a tremendous amount of experiences in my life. I've played semi-professional football. I've been backpacking around the world. I'm educated as a journalist from the Danish School of Journalism, but I've also lived in India, in Mumbai, in Paris, in France, and then I worked for almost a decade as a knowledge broker for international business schools, actually finding their stories and actually disseminating knowledge and telling stories about how people actually applied knowledge in a practical way. And now I'm a leadership advisor and a learning designer. So that's, I would say, you started out by saying that the focus on the outer world. I mean, I have a general interest in context, in understanding situations, and seeing connections, and looking at the world through many different lenses. And I mean, what I'm interested in, or what I'm driven by, is of course, I mean, combinatorial creativity, and a very, very, I'm a very curious person, basically. So that helps a lot in my line of work, at least.
Okay. Well, yeah, maybe you can take it. Well, I'll take it from there, because, well, you know, one of the things that, you know, I frequently get asked the questions what I actually do and what kind of line of work I'm in, and I'm always a bit confused about whether I'm a practitioner or a scholar, and or whether I'm a farm boy or whether I am an academic. I don't really know. I'm like Kenneth. My background is extremely mixed. And most of the work that I do today is with international, global organizations. It's primarily on key talent level or senior executive level, and yada yada yada. You know, I could do all the credentials, but I think what really, you know, if I have to say what really floats my boat, I think it's when I was a young boy. I grew up on a farm in the southern parts of Denmark, and I remember coming home one day from school. I must have been around 14, 15, and my dad was sitting on the staircase outside our barn, where, you know, we used to grow pigs in there, you know. Like most people in Denmark, really, most farmers grow pigs in Denmark. But this is back in the 70s, and I remember walking up to him, and he said to me, "You know, Anders," he said, "I've just had it," he said. I've just had it. I'm going to give up farming. Now, what you have to think about is we come from a long line of farms. This was 400 years of farming that happened on that same slot of land. Just giving up farming. It wasn't just giving up, changing one job to the other. It was actually giving up in desperation because he saw the reality that he'd been grown up in, the life that he'd had. He could no longer match up with what he was doing. He just couldn't live in that life anymore. He was just lost. You know, it was at the time when farming changed from being a lifestyle to being industrial. Mm-hmm. And I would say that ever since that day, I would say that the main purpose in my life has been to help people that are lost, really, whether they come from that trader life or whether today they are, you know, running global companies, you know, being the CEOs in a global company. It's the same human feeling of being lost that I find and that I kind of recognize in people everywhere today and on all levels in organizations. So what do? Well, I try to navigate and help people that are lost, finding their, you know, I hope helping them to find their way back to some place where they will find some kind of foundation and understand just what they can, how they can continue their lives and how it can, you know, how it can be meaningful to them, how they can find purpose in it.
So the things that
does that answer?
Yeah, it does. I've just it's a really exciting description that you've both put. I'm thinking of the synthesis that the two of you will have created with leadership, and you know that kind of. You're talking about lostness, and I'm thinking about the context that you refer to, Kenneth. That we're in a time of, you know, people use the word liminal times. There is so much upheaval going on. So the bringing of your kind of interest in the external and the trends and the context, and the bringing of Anders, your bringing of the, you know, helping folks who are lost. And there's that inner journey that people go on when they go, like your dad, I don't know where I'm at, where I'm going, and what's the point. And I know that kind of the narrative around lostness and so on comes through in the work that you've done developing your compass. So with that, you know, there's a synthesis that you've brought together in your both of your interests. What are some of the shifts that the two of you see going on in the world today that sort of has moved you to create leadership?
Yeah. Well, why don't you do that one?
Well, I think, you know, I think what we're talking about is basically there are, I mean, two kinds of changes going on in the world, and you can talk about shocks, which are like financial vulnerability. The situation in Greece, for instance, just last Sunday, wars and terror. You can have fluctuating oil prices and movements in the world. These are things that happen gradually or out of the blue, so to speak. And then you have the slides, the more incremental changes, the climate change, the technological development, globalization, and shifts in demographics as well. And you know, all of this is just mixed in a big pot, and I think what's really difficult for people, and especially leaders, is to make sense of all of this. Also because the way to make sense of this is looking often at these changes through one certain angle of the lens, and that's also coming from the old industrial paradigm of looking at things often in a very linear way. And what we're basically saying is that, well, in order to actually live comfortably, but also to navigate in this world, then people have to engage in a mind shift and a skill shift and a behavior shift, and in organizations also a system shift. And what do we mean by that? It's basically, you know, the shifts are actually a response to the shocks and slides, meaning that for instance we move from that whole movement from me to we. We're talking a lot more about trust, how important trust is in the workplace nowadays. Also moving from this short-sightedness and fulfillment of shareholder needs to a more long-term view and a systems thinking and integrative thinking about things. So that's the mind shift. And when we talk about the skill shift, it's more like, you know, embracing this embracing curiosity, and also having this feeling of making sense of things, and how do you actually build that, and also Anders and I, we had this discussion yesterday evening about I mean, the use of technology and how it's both a good thing and a bad thing in our life, because do we choose to actually master, or how can we master the tools and not let them actually be enslaved by them? And I mean, there are so many ways of actually embracing technology and using it for a good purpose, and using it for social learning, and also being able to recognize patterns. And I think when we're talking about that, of course, ties in with the whole behavior shift. Also, it's about, we're moving gradually from a perception of things that it's about taking as much as you can, and it's a win or lose game. Where we're talking about that is also about giving, about being relevant in the world. That you need to be socially relevant as a company. We see that also with a lot of companies actually looking to identify and bring out their purpose. That's actually basically just an exercise in actually being socially relevant in people's minds. And I think there's another aspect in that also, that we move gradually from this whole idea of pushing things, pushing knowledge, pushing information, pushing messages and marketing, to actually pulling people in by being relevant. And then there's also this whole major shift from moving from heroic leadership to actually distributing leadership, and understanding that we're moving from hierarchies to what John Hospen would call hierarchies. And how do we respond to that? And of course, the whole culture shift that we're talking about in all of this, which is the outcome of this, is that it is a new reality, and that's why people are looking for purpose, for meaning, for and we talk about a lot about engagement. How do you engage people in the workplace? But also, people express this longing for a place to belong, basically. Can
I say something? Because I think because what you can also hear, John, it's that this whole, it's just a massive change. We're kind of sensing. I mean, if it had, shifts have always happened in human lives. Shift it's a human fundamental. Sure. I still remember, when I tried to introduce change management to a larger global Indian company, and I said, well, they asked me in their portfolio what is missing, and I said, oh, you don't have anything about change management. He looked at me and he said, this is India. You either change or you die.
Yeah.
And so that has been the truth in some continents where scarcity kind of rules. Now we're seeing a global move towards scarcity. All of a sudden, scarcity is more on a global level. There are 7.5 billion people, a lot more competition, and you could say the change pace has just picked up. Where these big shifts happen, you could say, generationally speaking, we would always identify big shifts, and we say, oh, every 25 years it changes how we perceive reality and culture and so on and so forth. But today, that pace is just up. I mean, we're talking about, people like us, we would have to get used to a new interpretation of reality every 25, 30 years. Kids today do it with 5-year spans, 1-2-year spans. Sometimes the big changes are just happening so fast. It's like watching culture in a strobe light, and all of a sudden it's changed and you hadn't seen it coming. So we're just like my dad, constantly sitting out there and feeling lost, sitting on those benches feeling lost, because the pace of changes is gone up. And I think this is why this whole aspect of bringing these different shifts in, the mind, the skills, behavior shift, and the system shift into a cultural context. Because, let's face it, the purpose of learning has always been sense making, and sense making condensed has always led into a cultural understanding, meta stories about how reality is put together. But all of a sudden, we're finding ourselves in a flow of changes where we don't have the time to consolidate our understanding of what's up, down, what's right and what's wrong, which means that we're in a constant flow we have to be in a constant flow of learning, relearning, and relearning, and throwing out what we learned the one day. We have to throw out the next. You remember the days back when the computers were new? We learned floppy disk, and then you had to learn all this. You know, all that knowledge was thrown out just 10 years later. And if let's take that on a global level with the changes that are happening. We're throwing out these systems that we've learned regularly because reality just changes, and it just puts a strain on people. What was that going down the right line here?
I think it's very accurate. I think, John, what we've talked about earlier also is that if you look at this as a I don't like using the word a game because I don't think what we're doing here is a game.
No.
But the rules of the games are changing. So what can you do in this world to actually, live in this world without being feeling that you're actually losing yourself in this. And I think what we talk about is actually that people need to grow this adaptive game perception, that the perception of things need to change, and basically, it's this ability to both anticipate, but also to make sense of and analyze a different situation, and then come up with a timely response. And the future is constantly in the making, so it's also about actualizing this emerging future by being capable of doing this and understanding that, for instance, a good friend of ours, Harold Yaki, calls this living in perpetual beta, and I think that's really true. It's in a constant becoming that we're living,
and that's the challenge for people, and there's a meta level of understanding that I think that needs to kind of come about. And then when I hear about your work in creating that sort of the mind shifts, the shifts in perception, this adaptive game perception, I think that's absolutely key, because I think I like Harold's terminology of that, because I think the shift broadly is moving from this sort of old paradigm, you kind of talked about it, a mechanistic, that kind of moving to a sort of post-scientific, post-mechanistic world where we've grown up thinking that the universe is controllable and predictable, and it's also desirable to control and predict it. So now we're seeing all of our models and tools for controlling and predicting are just failing, and so I kind of see the same sorts of accelerated changes. And I know there's a lot of stuff out there in the media about it's not being accelerated, we're just seeing it more, but I do think there are a lot of changes that are accelerated because that the old paradigm has sort of come to the end of its shelf life. Now we're having to get used to living in beta, that the universe is neither is it controllable nor predictable, nor is it desirable to control or predict it. So how can we, I guess, prepare ourselves, develop the capabilities to be in that constant, like you described, Anna, as that life in India. That was my perception when I first went to India, of looking down my hotel balcony at the life that was on the street, and I went, okay, this is a different world. And it was a really interesting experience, sort of jumping in that river, and you have to learn how to deal with what emerges in the moment. It's fascinating stuff.
Can I ask a question or drop something?
Cool.
Yeah. Because you're talking about the perpetual beta state that we live in, and change is going quicker and quicker. I mean, I don't know exactly what kind of rule it is, but the development of technology goes quicker and quicker, and that means that computers get quicker, so everything happens faster. And like Anna said, we have more people on the globe, so there's more brain power to change things quicker, and there's a certain need to change quicker in order to adapt to this wave of change that we have. So if you talk about adaptation and teaching and these kind of things, is it that you teach somebody to adapt instead of teaching them, look, this is a new app or this is a new form of communication, so we're going to teach you that? But instead of that, you teach them to be aware of this perpetual state that we're in order so their mind gets wrapped around the fact that it actually happens. Because I think that's, I don't know if that is what you teach, or whether it is something that it's just, in my mind, sounds really good.
It's a good question.
Yeah, it's, and I think, I mean, all of this ties in basically also with the notion that you know that also with working with technology, here that you have this exponential line that technology is changing us really fast, but our ability to learn is sort of a constant. So you have that intersection where we're moving from the old industrial age to the, you can call it the network age or the connected age. That suddenly the change is really exponential, but our ability to learn hasn't grown with that. But I think, Anders,
well, yeah, but because it's exactly, the way I've always kind of looked at it is, and people have talked about it. It's not like it's, this is not rocket science. Other people have talked about that cultural evolution has bypassed the human biological evolution. That means that we're lacking behind. Things have paced up in such a way that our usual way of adapting has changed. We can't keep up with the pace. All of a sudden, it's like the machine. In science fiction, it's all about the machines, so artificial intelligence taking over the world. The apprentice becomes the teacher, and so on and so forth. And now coming back to what you're saying, Roger, so how do we work with people around that? Well, what we find is that today we have forgotten the human fundamentals or the human basics about learning. Now, that's where our idea about, or our thinking is around triple loop learning comes in. Much of what happens today is very much about teaching people policies or practices, but it's very little about actually doing practice. The single loop learning is learning things in practice. That's how we change our behavior. That's about what we do. Double loop learning is more about learning a policy of practice or how we do things. And triple loop learning is kind of the meta understanding, the one that informs our perception or the why we do things the way we do things. And you could put it this way, that these are all enmeshed in one another on several levels, and they feed into one another. If you learn the one thing, you learn another thing. Put it very simply, people practiced medicine before there was, you could say that before there was an actual practice or theory around medicine, before there was an education around medicine, before you could even talk about the principles of performing medical procedures, right? That was all, so people practiced way before. But what we've forgotten in many of our schooling systems today is we've forgotten the single loop learning. That means focusing on teaching people a practice before theory, and we have never really started talking about the triple loop learning. What are the meta understandings behind? What does it make us think? What is the perception that comes out of when we work with things like the way we do? What is and this is coming back to also what Kenneth was saying a minute ago, this whole thing about social relevance. Because if people just focus on how to do a good practice, let's say a good practice of financing, it becomes the closed system where you don't have to get your hands dirty in practicing by, let's say, like they do in like Grameen Bank was by lending out money to the poor people, handing it over directly. So if all you do is learn the actual policy or practice of financing, sitting in an ivory tower and not getting your hands dirty, how are you going to see the consequences of what you do? And if these catch up with you, you get surprised. And secondly, what is the purpose behind financing? I ask sometimes even when I ask adults, or senior executives, I say to them, what is money really? What is the financial sector? What is money really? What is it a symbol for? And a lot of people don't know. It's like Marx would say it's accumulated work. There are other definitions, but people have no meta understanding of what they are working with. They don't have that triple loop learning. So, and that's kind of lost in many of the business schools today. It's all about how we do things. It's not about what we do exactly. It's not a real practice.
Why?
Or why we're doing it exactly. So it's just all we do today is we work with people in what I call a double loop learning loop. So it's not, So it's not founded. And it's not taken on a higher level. I don't know if that made sense.
Makes sense to me. It's very much in line with how I approach learning as well, Anders. That triple loop. It's got to be on a very deep level to create some real significant shifts, so that when you open your eyes, you see the world differently. It's a bit like, I can sometimes liken it to that moment in that film, The Matrix, where he's looking at the screen of all those things and he sees. I think people have got to have those. Okay, I have seen something. I cannot unsee this. My world has changed unutterably forever now, and those deep changes have got to happen in the context of all these big slides and shifts that you're talking about as well. So yeah, that makes sense.
But I think also, a lot of often we mention this. I mean, we make this distinction between the use of a map and a compass, for instance.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you about that. Yeah.
What's the difference actually? Because, I'm a very big fan of this. I think we even talked about that earlier on, John. I'm a very big fan of Borges as a writer.
Yeah.
And there's this wonderful story about this empire where a bunch of cartographers are actually asked to draw the empire, and they end up drawing a map that is even bigger than the empire. So they have the perception of reality actually becomes reality. And I think that's such a fine image of what's going on in a lot of companies today, that we have this perception of things that, well, we put in performance management systems, we have these kind of rewards, we do recruitment in this way. We've drawn a lot of maps, but does it make any sense? In a lot of times we're just talking about common sense, and I think that's probably also why people are so disencouraged, or not encouraged to actually go to work and look for meaning.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. You reminded me of a story actually when you talked about that with the maps versus compass and the use that the Borges story. You reminded me of a moment when I was doing some work with some folks, and they had the HR person went to the whiteboard and was drawing the traditional hierarchical tree diagram of the organization. But as he was speaking, he was narrating something completely different, and it was a really bizarre moment when it was like sometimes if you're listening to your iPod and watching television with the sound down, you hear something that doesn't match. And I was hearing this really wonderful story about this really life-giving place where everyone was providing shared leadership and they were stewarding this organization. The picture, it was like he was trying to shoehorn the real common sense of what was actually happening into an old map. And that for me was really pivotal for me of how some of this stuff we just have to change those deep models of how we view our daily lives at work.
Yeah.
And I think a compass, I mean, your use of the word compass, and earlier, unless you were talking about people being lost, I think compass is a really compelling description of the work that you two have developed.
Yeah.
Yes, and also because I think, it's sort of a headline to all of that, I would say, is about that this is a process of discovery.
Yeah.
That you mentioned the liminality also, John, as being in a sort of in a confusing place, an in-between place between two worlds, basically. And when you're in that place, and of course, I think there are a lot of people who are at the forefront of things, the early adopters. They find themselves in there at the moment, and it's a confusing place because you do, as Anasi said, you don't know what's up and down, and you don't know what's right and wrong. And you have to be in the question with people rather than coming up with all the answers and just displaying all the answers to new problems or challenges.
Can I ask, because I'm interested in the context in which you place your work. Like as you mentioned business schools, and I think you've both mentioned business schools. You've talked about your family history a little bit. You've talked about your background, Kenneth, of this sort of very general, this sort of generalist trajectory that you've been on. And I'm interested in, we're in this world and it's affecting everyone. And some people feel that kind of, I don't have a purpose in my work, but they can't make much sense of it. There are people in organizations that you might be working with. Where do you go to and bring your work? Because everyone needs the sort of thing you're describing. Everyone needs to make sense of this bizarre stuff that we're going through.
John, mind your microphone.
Okay.
Very good. Well, I think one of the there's one aspect in our compass which you could say it's one of the directions, or whether it's one of the directions or the core, is about what we call clarity. So clarity is more like, if there's no sense making in the outer world, you need to start making sense from your inner world and outside. It's not about it's not the Greek classical Greek idea, know who you are, but it's more about coming to terms with your history and what it has left in you, the legacy, your own practice. Again, this is single loop. Your own practice, your own experience through life has left in you. So rather than thinking in terms of these normatively defining what is the right thing and the wrong thing, it's about kind of helping somebody go on a journey into their, helping people journey down the past and looking at what were the significant experiences in my life that helped form me. And out of these significant experiences, how do these link into the things that I find are under attack, but which at the same time could be my non-negotiables, like my value systems. So I would say clarity is about helping people connecting their own history with the values that exist in their life here and now, and making conscious decisions about which ones are actually wearing the pants. It's like, the old Austin and Searle idea of that in any sentence, one word always wears the pants and defines its meaning. Same thing here. It's about accepting that you may have, you could say, words in your vocabulary or values in your system that may not, from a normative point of view, be very attractive. Like one leader I was working with, I can give several examples, would have, for instance, money. Money ahead of family. If you had to make Sophie's choice between family and making money, it was money. Now, that's not necessarily very sympathetic. You could say that. But at the same time, it was everything that kind of identified what he was doing in his world. And that was how he was navigating. By recognizing that he had that value, however, and that it was a core value in his life, it also made sense in the light of some of the things he was facing externally and some of the things he was doing, that he would have, if that was his value, there would be responsibility tied in with that. So and that's back to this social relevance that one needs to think about, because if you think about money ahead of family, again, it might not be sympathetic, but he could do great stuff that way. So what this whole journey into clarity is about is for people to truly know what is it that they actually, what are the choices, what are the things that they're choosing by, and how should that influence the way that they move forward. Now, when we talk about moving forward, we're talking about, living and integrate. One thing that I've always had a hard thing with is this whole idea about work-life balance, which I think is an abomination, because it's something that,
totally agree.
My dad about that, and he would say, "What is that?" He lived an integrated life. It was when life stopped being integrated that he felt misery, when he was lost. So, because he was not living according to the core values he had. He knew he had to make money, but honestly speaking, making the pigs thrive and feel good and having shiny piglets running around was made him more happy than anything else. Now that made him very unpopular with my grandfather, who was all about making a contribution to society. But what my dad really wanted to do was grow happy piglets. So in an industrial age, he couldn't live according to that. He felt disintegrated, and maybe the whole idea of work-life balance then would start popping into his mind at that point in time. And that's what I'm seeing with a lot of people today, is they don't lead integrated lives. They talk about work-life balance, but it's not about that. I think it's about something else. It's understanding your principal values and the ambitions that you may have in many aspects of your life. So when we work with leaders, we definitely don't just talk about their professional value system, which a lot of other people do that. I mean, but what we talk about is also what happens in their personal life. So what are the values that are important to them to live in relationship to the significant others that they have in their lives? And what are the values they also have in their relationship to themselves, which have got nothing to do with the family or the kids and stuff like that? And what are the dilemmas that exist between these different value systems? A lot of people, when they talk about work-life balance, it's all about that these values don't match up. So they want to do excellent work, maybe. So they have excellence as part of the value system professionally, but they have family, and so how do they make, and so how do live out both of these values? And it's making people understand these dilemmas. It's making them understand that a value system can be contradictory. I mean, We all know that the French civic virtues are the best example of contradictory values. We see that in the arms, the NRA discussing with the Congress in the U.S. Not to politicize things, but what it is, it's if you look back, it's all about: is it freedom that you adhere mostly to? Is it freedom wearing the pants, or is it brotherhood? And the same thing happens in individuals. We have these inbuilt, ongoing dilemmas, which, when living under value to its extreme, will always lead to that you will exclude other elements of your value system. So which ones are wearing the pants in which particular situation? So you can have a set of values that are in your professional sphere that create a dilemma in a particular context with your values in your personal or private sphere. And how do you deal with that? Instead of saying you can fix a problem, you have to work with leaders in such a way that they constantly, all depending on the context, can reconcile these dilemmas as an ongoing thing. So instead of telling them one shoe fits you, it's giving them the old saying about instead of giving people a fish, which would be one solution, we are trying to help them understand how to fish, how to work around these, because it's going to be a constant, especially because of this high flux that you have, this living in constant beta. You constantly get into new situations where it will constantly create new dilemmas.
So you're talking about, you use the word integrated many times, you're talking about integrity, like the real sense of integrity of being integrated. Like you've got these dilemmas and those tensions that go on inside. There is that very large gray area, for example, of the personal and the professional in terms of learning and development, and people that come to work and they leave themselves at the door. And for me, like when I think about what you were saying, correct me if I'm wrong, having an integrated sense of self, even though that there are these dilemmas, how do I resolve these tensions and still sleep with myself comfortably at night? I've done some things in the private sphere or the personal sphere, but both of those still sit, I suppose you might call it, if you could, a meta value. They still both sit comfortably with me. I'm not screwing some people over while being kind over here. I can still sleep comfortably with myself at night because I live an integrated life.
You live an integrated life, but that calls for But it's a constant adjustment that you have to do, because any new context, any new development, any new push means that you constantly have to adjust that.
Absolutely.
Just to give you a concrete example. The situation in Greece, not to be political about that, but I've swap between different positions. Oh, they should not be that troublesome, and they should not give people that give Germany so much heck. And on the other side, I'm like, oh, we shouldn't squeeze them that much. I'm kind of looking at that as something that influences the way that I think about what's going on in the world. We're talking about people's lives in Greece, right? And it just constantly forces me into kind of saying, looking at this and saying, okay, so even though I don't understand both sides, which one is actually wearing the pants here? What is it? How do I reconcile what this invokes in me? How do I reconcile these different movements that happen in me? Because as human beings, we would like to have one interpretive way of looking at the world, but all of a sudden we're standing in front of a multiplicity of different impulses or things that are happening in our surroundings, which constantly forces us to reinvent and relook and generate ourselves. So you need a methodology that gives you the opportunity to constantly do that, rather than fixing the problem at one time. I guess that's again back to triple loop learning and stuff.
So otherwise you have to deal with two problems at the same time. Every time something changes, you have to deal with the change itself and with adapting to the change. So if you have a basic methodology on how to deal with these things, maybe that's what I'm trying to say earlier with teaching adaptation, is that people learn to deal with these changes, then instead of dealing with the changes and then learning how to deal with that change. If you just have that basic core methodology, then it should be easier to go along with the changes that are happening.
Yeah, you're completely right, and I think maybe even to clarify it a bit. I think that's the whole idea of when you have to navigate in this world, then you have to be willing to adjust 4 things. I mean, your thinking, your learning, your approach to learning, your ways of doing things, your doing, and your being, your individual self. And I think if you just have this, if your approach is that, well, I have to go to one of the major business schools and pay a lot of money and sit down for a week and work with other people in the same situation and then come back. I mean, it's not long ago I saw that one of the leading business schools in the world has just introduced this module into their MBA called Future Navigation. But what that basically was, it was actually just well, you have these leaders coming in for the MBA, and then you sit down with them, you actually put them in contact with other leaders and ask them and tell them to ask questions about what's going on in their business. Then they go back and then they interpret it and actually present it at a conference. The thing is, the idea in theory is really good, because it's a different approach, and you're not just having this classroom teaching from a teacher to a student. But in reality, what could be useful for anyone attending an MBA would be able to learn through social technology, so you could keep up with that future navigation or navigating the future yourself, and you don't have to pay one of the major business schools to actually go back, and then you will have to learn what was just the flavor of the day that day. But actually teaching people how to do this, teaching people how to learn for themselves, challenging business schools, of course, the whole business model, because then it's not just in case learning, it's actually just in time learning, where you can connect with people all over the world. You can listen in on different radio channels and having listening posts all over the world, and be connected with other people, and building also a personal learning network, basically, where you can tap into the zeitgeist. And that's what we're talking about with the whole sense-making part, and why, for instance, new media literacy is quite important also for leaders today. And Anders and we are not talking about a social leader.
No.
I think there's more to it than that, and I'm not too fond of people who just say, well, people or leaders have to be on social media. That's just one part of it. But the dynamics of it, understanding the underlying dynamics of social media, knowing how it can actually improve your critical thinking, knowing which people to connect with, and actually who shares the good stuff, who do actually. I mean, there's a reason why we guys are sitting here today, because we got to know each other through social media, and then actually we met at a conference. So that whole story about actually meeting first online, and then I mean, it's not long ago we met in London, John, where we talked about a lot of things, and we talk about private things in our lives that are important to us, and just expanding that relationship. But it starts in a social sphere, and that, I think, is something we all need to tap into, because it's such a powerful learning experience, and I think keeping up with what goes on in the world is that's just a very, very useful way of going about it.
Well, it's true. It's in some cases the answer to a reasonably complicated question that you're dealing with can be almost literally a tweet away. Right, you can just post a question on Twitter, and if people are paying attention, then you can have an answer relatively quick that would actually solve that problem, something that you would otherwise be taking a long time to figure out, or which other way you would gather that information. So it's definitely very valuable. Yeah.
But I think it's about, if you look at it, one way of looking at it is like, this is learning how to navigate in the social world fueled by digital technologies is a bit like learning a new language. I mean, not long ago, I mean, my wife is from Africa, and she learned how to bicycle not long ago, and I had to run behind her, almost like holding the bicycle, and it's a bit like that. You have to take many of these leaders by the hand and actually sit down with them and have them go through experiential learning where they actually do this themselves. I mean, it sounds really, really simple, but I've been sitting down with people who send out their first tweet at a conference and actually connected with an ambassador through that way, which was quite important for that guy's future work. And you know, he was just sitting and saying, is this okay? Is this, should I be doing more? How do I include it? What's his Twitter handle? What is a hashtag? How do I put it in there? You know, very, very basic, simple things. But it's like learning a new language, and I think this is not just something that is you know, it's just not a matter of understanding social media or using media for marketing. I'm a very big opponent, or I'm in opposing that social media is just about marketing.
Absolutely.
It's a tool to connect with people in the world and have interesting conversations. And like Anna said, and just to tie it in with that, you know, if you know your own value system and what is important in your life, that's how you become relevant to other people. Also, having that clear understanding of, so what should I be sharing, for instance, what kind of conversation should I be engaging in, what's my interest, what's my preferences, and also making sure that you connect with people who are in opposition to yourself. Because so it's a matter of also creating, of course, a sort of these listening posts that are not just like yourself, but also people who can actually burst that filter bubble once in a while and bring in different perspectives in life. And I think in terms of when we talk about the compass, it's the interconnectedness of things, the understanding clarity, or having clarity about yourself as a human being. Mastery is about learning and becoming and knowing how to seek, sense, and share things, and establish this personal learning network. And the relevance part is then, how do you engage with this? How do you influence people as a leader? What's your purpose in life, and how do you bring that out? How do you make it compelling for people to actually engage with you in that purpose? And of course, the agility part, the last part of the compass is being able to shift your balance whenever it's needed, and you know, establish also, you know, this is basically also about having an authentic narrative and being able to communicate that to people and shift position efficiently without compromising your values. That's the agility part of the compass.
Could I say something there? Because the example that I gave about Greece is exactly that's exactly where my agility was challenged. And I mean, and as human beings, we tend to we do like to categorize. We can just see this new movement of radicalization. You know, people join radical movements. You know, like in Denmark, we've had a growth in the ultra right because they say this is the right thing to do, and that's the wrong thing to do. You have radicalization also in like with in the Middle East, where all of a sudden something which is utterly brutal and 50 years ago would have been perceived as complete, you know, as complete unspeakable violence, all of a sudden becomes that affects people. So people get quite radical because they're not agile. You can't be in two camps. You know, you just can't be in two camps, and so you don't have the agility and the ability to move between different positions and say both of them are right, and both of them are wrong in some sense. You end up in categories, and the funny thing that I'm observing, especially about young people, and I'm talking about the very, very young now. I'm not even talking about, my kids are 18 and 19, and they even think that they are lacking behind even younger kids who are way more capable of constantly flopping in and out of different realities. Like, I have this little cousin of mine, and she is more connected. Everybody's got these stories, but she's very connected to someone in Greece also. But what's really interesting is that person in Greece is explaining the whole Greek situation to her as kids talk about it. And all of a sudden, I sit down with a young niece, and she can explain to me things that I hadn't grasped. Because not this old-fashioned brain, because my brain is very categorical, and they can do that.
Yeah. They do get wired in a different manner than we are. I mean, we all remember black and white television and only having 2 channels, right?
Yeah.
And now it's the amount of channels these kids just are able to absorb. It's for us, and we're tech savvy. We're there. We're hip. We're trendy. We're cool. But still, I mean, you're just saying it. I mean, children, young adults of 18, 19-year-old, realizing that they're having difficulty keeping up with this stuff, and then you have, and it used to be like a funny thing. Explain it to me like I'm 4 years old, but there's a fair chance when a 4-year-old is explaining you stuff now that you don't even get it.
Well, so, I was thinking about that. You know, I'm thinking that there's a thread through the whole of this conversation, and the word is learning, and all different dimensions of that conversation, which is really vital. And at 4 years old, by the time we've reached 4, most of us have probably learned to climb a tree. We've all learned to speak our first language. We've all learned to walk, and a whole raft of other things before we go to formal schooling or learning. What then becomes ossified in our minds as to what constitutes learning. And it carries on in business schools. You've described a little bit about that, about some of the stuff that people learn, and then the half-life of that knowledge is a week, and then they have to come back and do another thing because things have moved on. We've got an inbuilt ability to learn, I think. So it sounds like what you're kind of trying to reignite or tap into is people's natural ability to learn and to shift the perception of what constitutes learning. And I'd like to kind of ask at this point, because we've touched on it briefly when we spoke before, Kenneth, just in case versus just in time learning. Because the title of the podcast, which I failed to mention, is Why is Learning Important? And it's in the context of these changes, developing the users of the tools, not just giving them new tools.
No, yes, exactly.
Yeah. But also sometimes, you know, we forget that you can't just be introducing tools to people without explaining the use of it.
Well, exactly.
And I think, you know, I think there are many aspects in this, and I think what Anders was talking about here is also a matter of that, you know, a person that I respect highly is Roger Martin from Rodman School of Management. You know, he's written this book called The Opposable Mind. That
wonderful book. Thank you for the recommendation. I enjoyed it immensely. Yeah.
Basically, it's about being comfortable with not just being in looking at the world in sort of A and B choices, but also that your solutions to things can actually come from a combination of A and B. It's not an either or, but it's a both and. Yeah. And that both and is of course extremely difficult for many people, because it's sort of an inclusive way of thinking that you can't exclude everything, and it's, you have to take in more variations of choice basically, and I think this all boils down to decision making. And do you make the right decisions? And maybe some of the challenges or the problems we've seen also with the financial crisis is also that, well, you know, we tend to make A and B choices.
Exactly.
And when we talk about changing perception, it's also about being comfortable with not just choosing A and B because that's the most comfortable choice or comfortable space.
And because I was just I was just listening to my own thoughts and some of the things that were being said. Also, I got to think of a very old colleague of mine. His name is Ralph Schneider, who once gave a little speech about, you know, different organizational realities, and he said this fantastic thing that. And this is now, we're talking just 10 years back, and he said, you know, we have a first generation leaders. That means like leaders that had grown up in an old reality that does no longer exist, leading a second generation organization, or leading second generation organizations, which is old reality, also something that doesn't exist, in our third generation reality, which is what we're facing right now. And with new social media, I would love to add on to that picture and say, well, with a fourth generation workforce, which are actually on the brink of emerging reality. So the kids we're seeing today that grew up with smartphones and so on and so forth, we haven't even seen what that's going to do to them.
Yeah,
what we're doing right now we're still like, we're still lacking behind. We have the obligation. I mean, and one of the things why I love to work with leaders and executives is because they're representative. They're representative people of society to some degree, but the big differentiator is that they have way more influence. They actually have the power to influence things. Today, that power is tied in with even more obligations to actually being aware of what is going on, and people should force themselves into learning and learning how to learn again. I'm 53. Yeah, come on. 5 years to retirement. If I make my bonuses the next 4 or 5 years, yeah, well, that shouldn't stop you, because in 4 or 5 years, everything changes, and you're the person in power. So you simply have the obligation to do so. You can't get radical. You can't say, oh no, I'm just gonna be like over here. I'm just gonna focus on making money, and then to hell with the rest. I'll be back, and I'll retire in 5 years. I don't care, because if our leaders in organizations do that, especially now with the growing influence of big organizations, they definitely have to take more responsibility on relearning how to learn.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's the key. It's relearning how to learn. That's the thing that will, I think, help folks sort of survive and thrive into the now and into the future, really. But it's that process of learning how to learn. Once you've got that, I think I think I have more hope if I saw more people having that. But again, it's tied into the current educational system of what we get told on an unconscious level, just in the messages of how learning is delivered, of what constitutes learning and what doesn't anymore constitute learning. Yes, you maybe did that to learn how to walk and ride your bike or whatever. That's not learning. Learning is this. So it's tied in with our educational system. It's quite a big context that you guys are working in. And I know, Kenneth, you and I have talked about schooling and in Africa and things like that. So it's quite a big stage you're playing on here of creating a shift in understanding of how learning happens.
Yes, and I think we had this conversation fairly recently, Anders and I, and I think maybe it's the material proof, or hopefully with time, that our legacy project should be to actually, or we want to create this project where we establish a school in Cameroon for obvious choices. I mean, it's to live an integrated life for me and my family, for my African wife and her family, Anders has always had a dream of helping street children, so there are all these things coming together, but also we see a potential. This is about doing good, of course, but there's also an egoistic aspect to this, because we can learn just as much. And I think what we can learn from Africa is actually the value of human relationships, because it's a relational culture that I think in many aspects of the Western world that we've somehow lost. That relational culture, for good and for bad, there are some value in that in Africa you don't ask people, so what do? You ask, who do you know? First question. So I think that says a lot about that approach, and I think that's something we want to build into what we do, and of course put some money aside to actually run that school. And I think also bringing leaders into that local community.
Right, that's what I wanted to ask about,
Yeah, and strip them of their titles. Let them be in that actual reality and that environment, that local community, where you strip them of their titles. They can't come there with all their answers. They have to be in the question with people and acknowledge that they might actually have a better solution than they have. But that the real value of learning is created in that space of being comfortable, of being in that flux and acknowledging that people can actually teach you something in any situation in life.
There's an actual example that was some years back. Maybe you have heard about this, but it was actually PricewaterhouseCoopers, which was working together with the UN, building a program called Ulysses, in which they would take some of their most income-earning junior partners and send them out in a defined third world project in order to see how they could use their profound skills as consultants in PwC to help a local project. So what they would do, they would re-engage them in concrete practice and responsibility of what my decisions, my financial decisions, what consequences do they have? What are the people I'm looking into the eyes? How are my decisions going to influence these guys? And then what they would do is on the sideline, they would have facilitators sideline with these, and they would visit them on an ongoing basis over those 3 months. And when they came back, they would try to integrate this new way of learning through practice and putting things into play in a real context with real people, not just in a policy or practice of policies, but in real practical implementation. And what has that done to me and my understanding of myself as a leader? And my responsibility to the world and my agility, how do I constantly stay agile? Because so I work in a global organization, so the decision I make here influences China in this way, but it does influence India in that way, and so on and so forth. This constantly changing of positions. It was a phenomenal program, and in many ways, I think that what Kenneth and I do with our legacy project is really saying, it's easy for us to sit down and have these ideas and these thoughts, but we have to walk that path as well.
Yeah.
We can't just sit around, because that would just be another set of classroom teachers preaching from a philosophical or a practice point of view, rather than actually really working with it and looking at what does it do to our own value system, what does it do to our own perception of reality in this world. And I think it's, I would say, part of what I love about this new social reality is that these opportunities are way more accessible than they used to be. And it's just something, I think if we want to preach this, we have to walk the talk.
Yeah. And I understand the stories you told about the PwC folks going, it's like the stuff that they take on, whether by accident or design, and bring back to their home countries as well, will create some really significant ripples. You go there and you know from having traveled to other places apart from your homeland that you develop an ability to be affected by others. Otherwise, you just don't survive. You'd go to India and then after 2 days go, I have to leave. If you're not open to be affected by others, which is kind of core to actor training or improv training, then the ripples and things that you take on, and the stuff therefore those PwC folks brought back in terms of how you might view policy decisions or how you might view corporate decisions, has some really good knock-on effects as well. So what you're talking about is sort of some deeper than I think network building, it's community building. You kind of look, like you say, look people in the eye and encounter them. And I'm going to be affected by you. This is going to change who I am as a person. And I say wonderful to that. I think it's absolutely fantastic that stuff occurs in the world.
Well, for me, and when I heard about that project, it was an eye opener for me. Because also, it was an eye opener in the sense of that you actually have organizations that do that kind of stuff, and it's not really globally known. I mean, it's something that they do because they think it's necessary to do.
That's right.
I always fascinating. I come across that a lot, and I think that what we're trying to say also, and what is built into our compass, is this whole thing about could something similar, the effect of this, learning people how to learn in real life, in interrelationship with other people. How couldn't that be useful in a different line of context? Couldn't we start utilizing that way of thinking also in business schools rather than just reserving it for practitioners in different organizations? Shouldn't it be something that we as
something fundamental?
Exactly.
Exactly, a fundamental. It's the question that comes down is how do I live my life, not how do I live my business life or how do I live my life as a manager. How do I live my life? Your perception opens really widely. And I think about conversations that we've had around generalism, for example. It's how do I live my life? It's about experiencing all of these things, and they all add to my life. All of it does. They all enrich me.
It would be very nice if you had the start of a young person's life when they come to school. Instead of they learn how to regurgitate whatever information is being put into their head in order to pass a certain test at some point.
Yes.
If you would be able to teach them how to learn the things that we've been talking about now, making your jobs obsolete, John and Hannes, and then that would be a good thing, by the way. And then, but they would come into life with a completely different notion of how to go about life in general, and the results of that would be difficult to imagine, really, how that generation would perceive the world and how productive they could be and how innovative they could be. I mean, we're already doing pretty good as a people, but we could do a lot better, and I like this way of thinking where we actually try and do something about that.
What you guys have been talking about is like you're preaching to the choir. I'm on board with that stuff. What as you bring out your compass and you present it to folks, what responses are you getting? Because it is a big shift in how we see work, life, learning, and all that stuff. Are people challenging you with some of this? Are they struggling a bit? Like what's the rest of the world saying? Because I'm your fan.
It's an interesting question, because we had some, we've sort of spent a lot of time in the workshop figuring these things out, and how can you actually work with this? How can you apply this in a practical manner? I've been attending the Global Drucker Forum for many years, and there you had the likes of Gary Hamel and Clayton Christensen and Roger Martin and Steve Denning, some very, very clever people talking about all these shifts and changes. So I think it should be no surprise to anyone anymore that this is going on. The interesting thing that Clayton Christensen said at the last Drucker Forum in November last year was that, well, maybe people have to give up that they're clinging on to all their old models themselves just to spur one idea and actually build on each other's models. And I think that's what we try to do. Incorporate. This is not rocket science, and it's not new. But what we've been trying to do is actually to do this in a practical manner and how does this work in the real life rather than just talking about it.
Yeah.
And when you ask us about the feedback that we get from people, is that we've had some meetings with some quite significant people in large organizations, and if they take the time to sit down and talk to us, so we don't do meetings that are just half an hour, 20 minutes, come and give me the bullet points. If people say that, we say, well, this is not for us. Find someone else to work with.
Yes.
We actually demand that they set off 3 hours to have a conversation around this. Where we ask them, first of all, what their challenges are. And we don't come in and present the compass. We just have a discussion around this. What we found is that often the challenges that they mention is completely something we've sort of inbuilt how you work within the compass. That's of course because we've taken some time to think about this as well, and had, I think, some good feedback from people along the way. And then we've gone through iterations. We've actually been practically applicating this in real life. So we've done some work with leaders over many years, where we've been doing and testing bits and pieces of this and going through iterations constantly. So it's not a new thing as such, but it's the interconnectedness between things that people really, really seem to get and see. Holy Moses, this is really interesting. How do you really work with this? And that's. But what we've also discovered in this process is that people often have a hard time saying, well, we have all these systems in place, so this is how we do things around here. We send people off to IMD or to Harvard, and we send them off to our high-flying big business schools, and well, how can we do this then? And I think this is not a matter of that you have to implement all of this. It's just a matter of co-creating with people and organizations that, well, you probably do some of this really well already. And then if you can add a chunk here about clarity, which is I find is quite important in all of this, well, that might be the solution for you. And some people would go all in.
What I find is because I love that question. It really is a nice question. What those 3 hours that we usually insist on gives us is an opportunity to show the interlinkedness between the different elements of the compass. So each element by itself, if we present that, people will usually go, yeah, we've done that. Yeah, we got one outfit over here that does that. Oh yeah, we'll send people off to IMD. So each element by itself, it's just like everybody's got a bottle of vodka in the cupboard. I guess, or gin if it's England, but we all have some kind of, we all have the basics there. So what we sometimes do when we go in is really just recognize that organizations actually do a lot of good. They do a lot of good stuff. We're just trying to link it and see what will be the synergetic effect of if we link these in a different way. What if we link all that you're doing with adding this on here and that on there, which is the co-creational part. And I think what one of the things that helps us get to that point is we start up with this whole thing about our learning principles, which is this whole thing about practice first. There's no discipline, or there would be no trait which came just from the business school. Everything is built on practice, which also means that any organization performs this practice in a different way. So any initiative needs to be built up around the spirit of the existing organization. So we're saying, every carpenter hammers his nails differently, and there's some trade in it, there's some experience in it, and that's why you got a business model. So we're saying, how can we build on the existing thing that you're doing, and just emphasize that before we change anything. Second thing is we have a clear definition of that we have a systems view, which is that we see everything as being interconnected. So what we're saying is we will not, if we go in here, all the different learning initiatives that you have around in your organization, so sales versus production versus HR, everything needs to somehow be consequently linked. You can't just have seminars that are around how to make the best sales and have some guy come in around that, and then over here you got somebody who talks about leadership. That needs to be linked. And what we're also saying is it's about integrated learning. So when you can't have McKinsey operate over there and we work with HR, if we have to work with you, and if it truly has to make an effect, we need to cooperate with McKinsey and they with us in order to create to create the culture in the organization. So by saying that, by bringing in our learning principles, I think what they're getting also is then when we kind of show them the compass, they automatically understand the systematics in how we are doing it. And what we're saying is, so each organization, the mix will be different. The mix of what you already do and what you are needs to be in the concept. So we're not kind of coming with a done concept. You do this. If you do this, the world is yours. You'll be the one in the world. Howard will write an article about you in 5 years. Instead, we'll be saying we got to operate exactly down the lines of what you're already good at. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. Yeah, it sounds very ecologically sound.
Yes,
everything connects to everything else, sort of thing. It works with the ecology of the whole, and kind of putting some of those connections together that may have been absent, and going in there, going, look, we have to work with everything, and you have to make sure everything is working with everything. Is a really sound, fundamental thing to do, I think.
Yeah, and it ties in also with the notion that in this world that we're living in now and will be inhabiting in the future, I think it's that the time of fixed models is completely dead. The time of the McKinsey model, bringing in this model and dragging it down on top of the organization and cutting away all the fat, that doesn't work anymore.
No. Both of us have worked, which is, for instance, it's an Indian conglomerate called Mahindra, and they have this new initiative. They didn't know whether they should call it vision a strategy or what they should call it, but it's called RISE. And what's so interesting about it, it's just one example of how one organization has approached this way of working on all levels in an integrated way. Is that they are partnering with everyone. So their idea is that you got to partner with your vendors, and your vendors got to partner with you, and you got to partner with the local community. So they have this whole partnership approach, and it's like one organization that really lives an integrated life. And in its wake of it, it's also creating leaders that live integrated lives. I've never seen a group of more hardworking people for as little pay as they're being paid in India, who are actually proud of what they're doing. Can I mention some of the projects, just the CSR project? Because for instance, they're doing these projects. They don't even call them CSR projects. They just call them their obligation, where they are doing 8 projects. Like they were a part of what they call the Lifeline Express, which is a train that's being sent around into different rural areas, where they do different operations, like against blindness, and I think it's what it's called cleft. Yeah. So this and that. So what they do is they pay for the train to drive out there. They pay for they fly out the surgeons, and they pay for the surgeons to fly out there who then volunteer. So they just operate 24/7. And then what they do is they ask for volunteers from their own organization. And what's really interesting, these volunteers then go out there and they're being paid. So they are still on the payroll. And you can volunteer as many years as you want. So you can do it again the next year for 2-3 weeks, and the next year for 2-3 weeks. And what's so interesting is they started up these programs, and in the beginning, they have several other programs. Too much to mention here, but they start up these programs, and what's really interesting is that they have these repeat people that keep contributing to these programs because it's on the payroll. They're doing work hours. It doesn't cost them $1. And so when they started up, the first year they had 2,000. The next year there was 5,000. Then they were up around 12,000. I don't know how many. There must be around 24,000 people that volunteer their time. The company pays their wages while they're doing what they call payback work. The actual work is specific, when I asked the organization, what about retention? Have you looked at retention? How does that influence retention? It hadn't even dawned on them. Because for them it was the idea that if they could help their employees do good in this world, and they
be a part of that local community.
It was like 6% of their revenue goes into these projects. 6%. I mean, they're a big player. So it's just interesting.
But it goes to show also, I think this. How your purpose actually ties in with your business model and your business, your way you operate a company. That the whole idea of looking at CSR as one project you have to take care of in one silo is just completely wrong. It's an integrated part of doing business, and that's, for instance, when I talked about the behavior shift, that the whole shift from actually giving rather than just taking, being a part of the local community and giving back and making sure that you actually, in Mahindra's case, that you enable people to rise, live a good life, coming back to that as well. What constitutes a good life? Well, those people who actually engage in those, in that volunteer work, they also have a very, very strong sense of self-worth, of actually helping other people, and just imagine what that does to your engagement at work. I think we got it all wrong when we talk about that engagement is something, once again, have to engineer. It's a scientific approach to management, which is completely wrong in this world that we're living in. We have to look at completely different metrics to get that right.
Absolutely, yeah. And it's if I'm a little bit sort of fluffy about it, when people are engaging in that sort of volunteer work, it also begins to help them to see how we're all interconnected with each other. They're working with folks who come from different sort of life situations, but they regain that sense of, I'm actually connected to everything that's going on. And in a world where there's lots of these dangerous slides and shifts happening, I think we need to have a mechanism, for want of a better word, to reconnect with the rest of the planet and see that what's going on in the Middle East and so on in Greece is me. You know, it was interesting the whole after the Charlie Hebdo massacre. Je suis Charlie Hebdo. Everybody begin, you know, for people to identify everything else that's going on in the communities. It's good for business, increases engagement from a bigger picture, but it also increases lots of other good things about the well-being of the world. So yeah.
But you know, John, that's part of what we work with in the relevance part. You know, in the organizational work that we do, you know, social relevance. How do you become relevant through your actions and not just through a branding, marketing exercise where you try to brand purpose? I think Mahindra is a very good example of a company who actually lives this. While you have Coca-Cola trying to own the word happiness, doing the same work they've always done, just spraying out commercials and trying to do these happy events. But that doesn't necessarily change things. And you can take Nestle as another company, another example of a company who really talks about having a purpose, but they really have a hard time living up to that. And people are out on social media today, and you cannot be relevant in people's perception. That's right. If you live that sort of double life.
Yeah. So purpose is beyond. I mean, they have a stated purpose, but the purpose that they actually enact doesn't fit the world anymore. You know, that maximize shareholder value as their purpose is.
That's why the values
purpose
it doesn't match their actions either. I mean, they have this sustainable or whatever. You know, obviously they have the popular buzzwords in order to put themselves on a certain an image that they create, but at the back end of whatever it is that they're doing, they don't care. They're not walking that walk. They're just doing whatever promotes the most revenue that they can possibly get out of it. And
but can I say something?
Is a brilliant idea, example of that.
Yeah. But if I can say something to that, I'm not sure, I'm not certain whether there's a will behind those actions. I think it's more complacency. Now, in my many years of experience with most of senior executives, there's an enormous amount of goodwill there. And there's an enormous want of doing things differently. And many of them, when they kind of fall back and say, oh shit, you know, nothing's going to happen, it's not because they don't want to, it's just because they don't know how to. Or there's no outlet for that goodwill, that human goodwill that I detect in many people. And part of what I think is I would even say part of what it is built into the compass is actually that people can learn different ways of letting that goodwill come out, because it's about relearning your role, it's about relearning your influence, it's about relearning your opportunities, it's about being agile enough to actually take these chances, it's about engaging on a different level than you've done before. It's learning. I don't want to get too philosophical about it, but it's kind of relearning how to humanely interact rather than just leading or rather than just doing your work, but to humanely interact with your environment in a relevant way. And I'm
not even sure if it's philosophical. I'd say it's just a very realistic perception of the world that we live in. I mean, it's something that John and I have discussed on numerous occasions, is that we tend to lose sight of the humanity of things, of the developments that we go through, and we're so focused on the digital age and the technology and what the technology can bring us, and we just stopped
and more clever ways to do some of the bad things that we're now realizing aren't so useful for us. So
yeah, exactly.
We only with our humanity.
Exactly. But you know what I really like about it? Then the concept we use to describe that is actually transformation, business transformation, digital transformation, blah blah transformation. This and that. You know, basically, this transformation is an adjustment to a culture shift. And if leaders understand that this is a culture shift in many aspects, that they have to adjust to, and not just call it a business transformation, a digital transformation, a HR transformation, a transformation of CSR. In my opinion, that showcases a lack of understanding of things, how things interconnect.
Yeah, absolutely agree with that.
We're going to be winding up shortly. I have one final question I'd like to ask both of you, and I probably could guess the answer, but I'd like to hear it from your mouths. Future shifts, are you hopeful for the future, bearing in mind all these shifts and slides and things that humanity's going through? Are you hopeful? Are you hopeful for the future?
I think it depends on when you ask.
In the morning.
I think I've got you in a good mood. So.
Yeah. Well, it is. I've often wondered about that. To be honest. Yes, I see a lot of people wanting to change. That keeps me going. I see how difficult it is for a lot of people, and when you lend them a hand and explain some of this stuff to them, how much they get out of it and how profound change they can actually bring forth. So that makes me very positive. It makes me very positive also. We have a younger generation who seem actually to actually at least wanting or seeking this kind of meaning and purpose in life, maybe in a slightly different way than former generations. I don't know if that wasn't the case in the 60s when we have the old hippie movement, but at least that makes me positive in a certain way. I also see the willingness among especially young people to just play with things, to remix things, to come up with new ways of combining things and actually trying to solve problems in the world by asking, what's my why and why am I in business? You see that a lot in young entrepreneurs, I think. And then you have the bad side of it is when you look at the whole Silicon Valley culture, where it's basically about making money for a lot of people at least in a short time and just living the good life and I think, I mean, having traveled as much in the world as I have, I am not necessarily always positive, because I've also seen how we pollute a lot in the world and how people are living in really, really difficult circumstances. So I'm sort of an ambivalent. I'm ambivalent with that question, to be honest. So that's why I said it depends on when you ask me.
Well, it's a very, very good question. I think that there's a couple of levels of where we can answer. Yeah, I don't think we would be working on the compass and trying to launch it if we weren't hopeful.
True.
I think it's built into that, and I think it's a fundamental human drive that we always believe in the opportunity of changing things, and I think we should. But I think one of the things that really makes me hopeful, and which always kind of makes me, just literally dance sometimes, is when I see the young generations continuing to be playful. What we by the old way of seeing things judge as being constantly naive and playful and non-responsible, I actually see that as probably the best trait that they have. And I hope, and I'm also seeing older generations, I'm noticing my own generation being constantly playful and constantly willing to experiment with things in reality. That honestly makes me very positive about the opportunities that are out there. So I don't know. On several levels, I'm very, very hopeful, and there's a lot of facts that might go against this, but I do say I refuse. I refuse to give up hope.
That's good.
Good on you. I'm with you, Anders. Yeah. Okay. Well, we do need to wind up. It's been a real pleasure. I cannot believe. Goodness.
Hour and a half. Yes.
That it's been a real pleasure talking with you guys. And thank you so much for giving up your time to join Rocky and I. So.
Thanks for having us.
Yes. Thank you very much for having us, guys. It was a real pleasure.
Real pleasure. Yeah. So that wraps up this week's podcast. And until next time, we'll say farewell. And you can subscribe at rwcast.com.
Yes.
Thank you.
And thank you for those who've been watching, because there were a few.
Yeah.
Oh, I should have taken my hat off.
Yeah, maybe you should have. Well, it's too late now. Okay, I'm going to stop the broadcast.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.